știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. E lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvântul fericire de mult și nu rostit, un drum cătam sub soare, strânsat de bucurii. Dar dacă astăzi mergem spre țări pe drum știut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. O, câte dulci cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
Стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Hello, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 14th of November 2025, and here we are with a live stream, which is going to be the second part of our analysis of the Great October Revolution of 1917. We talked last week principally about Lenin's analysis of the dual power situation that had existed in Russia prior to the October Revolution of 1917, and how that needed to be brought to an end by one class or another. So this is the second part, where we're going to look at more at the insurrection and another theme of the Great October Revolution, which is the problem that would be faced over and over again throughout the entire period of the Soviet Union's existence, which is the recurring belief, deluded belief, but a very strong one nonetheless, that the Soviet Union, or at the time Russia, could not carry through a revolution that that would be without the support of the proletariat in the West, particularly Germany, France, Britain, particularly Germany. In fact, that was for many, even in the Bolshevik Party of 1917, Germany was, or the German Revolution was an obsession, something that they felt like that had to happen. Otherwise, there would be no chance of them winning in Russia itself. And this, again, was a theme from all the way through Russian revolutionary history. In fact, it's older than the Bolshevik Party. It's older, I would argue, it's even older than Marxism, given the mixed influence that the Enlightenment theories and that the French Revolution had in old Tsarist Russia. So you look back at some of the early bourgeois attempted revolutionaries in Tsarist Russia, such as the Decembrists, who were a revolt of military officers inspired by Napoleonic and Enlightenment ideals in the early 19th century, after the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars, who failed, and many of them were executed. But they were very much influenced by the idea that they were bringing the ideals of the French Revolution to Russia. The Russian intellectuals of the middle 19th century, people like Herzen, and also Bakunin, for all his loud proclamations of pan-Slavism, also inevitably looked to the Western European thought as something that would help inspire them. And this is, of course, satirized by Dostoevsky in The Brothers Karamazov, with regard to the brother who is the sort of liberal intellectual type who is always looking towards the West for inspiration. And this, of course, like every other intellectual trend, has something of a double-edged sword to it, because on the one hand, yes, the bringing in of ideas from the countries that have been earlier into the Enlightenment is something that is very beneficial for the development of a revolutionary tradition, at least for a while. However, the problem with that bleeds over into a fanatical belief amongst many people in the Russian revolutionary tradition that if the powerful states of Central and Western Europe, again, particularly Germany, and later on this transforms itself into beliefs about the United States, but we're talking mainly about 1917 now, that without the revolution in Germany, there can be no hope in Russia, because Russia is too backward, the proletariat is too small, the peasantry too big, the peasantry is illiterate and ignorant and can't possibly forge a revolution. This is the belief not just of Trotsky in the 1920s, which he would repeat over and over again, and which his followers, by the way, repeat to this day. But it's the belief of plenty of the Bolshevik hierarchy on the dawn, when we come to the dawn of the revolution. The prominent members of the Central Committee of technically they were the RSDLP-B, Russian Social Democratic and Labour Party Bolsheviks at the time, still nominally in the same party as the Mensheviks. But this is the nature of the disagreement that was, or part of it anyway, that was had between Lenin on the one hand and Zinoviev and Kamenev on the other. Zinoviev and Kamenev vehemently disagreed with the decision that was made by the Central Committee to proceed with the planning of an insurrection. In fact, more than that, they ran to, particularly Kamenev, ran to colleagues of his or old comrades in the Mensheviks and blabbed about the plan. Now, strangely, funnily enough, Lenin, whilst excoriating them, left it at a rebuke. They still were entrusted with certain tasks during the uprising, having already betrayed it. Lenin was confident in his ability to bring them back on side, but the fact that one of the factors behind them revolting against the line pushed by Lenin, and the line was ultimately successfully adopted by the Central Committee, was this belief that not only was it impossible for them to build a proletarian revolution and build socialism in Russia without the assistance of again, Germany in particular, but also that Russia was too backward, and the only thing that what was needed now was a period of development of bourgeois democracy, and that rather than overthrow the provisional government, the line of Zinoviev and Kamenev was that the provisional government should just be controlled by the Soviets. This is very much something that, again, returns with sort of wobbling centrists. And when I mean centrists, I mean in the Marxist sense, those who wobble between being outright revisionists or reformists and those who are committed and dedicated revolutionists. There is this large group in the later 1900s in the middle, which I would argue Zinoviev and Kamenev fall into, along with people like Ryazanov and other major Bolshevik leaders at the time, who just simply did not think that this was possible, what Lenin was suggesting was possible. They, all of them, thought that they could adopt this position whereby the Soviets would control the Soviets would, through their power, control the provisional government. Now, of course, this had been, or this was disproven as being possible many, many times. The line taken by Zinoviev and Kamenev was that the problem with the Soviets before September of 1917, which was of course they were controlled by the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries. That was the problem, that with Bolshevik control over the Soviets, they could exercise control over the provisional government, the bourgeois government. Now, this was a line that was also repeated in the failed German Revolution of 1919, in fact, between 1918 and 1919. This was a line pushed by the so-called centrists in the SPD and what was called the USPD, which was a group which was Kautsky's group that broke away for a while from the SPD, and then that itself split in two. Some of it went to form the KPD, some of it went back to the SPD. What they were in favor of was a system which combined Soviet soldiers, sailors, and workers and peasant Soviets with a bourgeois government, with a bourgeois democratic presidential government. Now, again, this was something that popped up in the Spanish Civil War. The whole question of whether this was a wise idea was something that was very much discussed in the run-up to October. Now, Lenin, of course, is in exile when the planning begins for the insurrection. Lenin had been in exile since the July days, which, as we recall, was a mass demonstrations in Petrograd that were in favor of transferring all power to the Soviets. The problem with that was, of course, it was all premature, as Lenin pointed out at the time. And so this sort of semi-insurrectional mood was crushed by the provisional government at the time. And as we covered last week, what revived the revolution was the counter-revolution itself. The attempt by Kornilov to end the revolution actually helped in two ways. It revitalized the workers' organizations, because they were the ones who had persuaded Kornilov's force to disperse. But also, it also critically damaged the credibility of those in the Soviets, such as the Mensheviks and the Social Revolutionaries, who had backed the provisional government, because the provisional government of Kerensky was rumored to be on side with with Kornilov. Now, Kerensky denied this. He later said that he had battled Kornilov, that he wasn't plotting with him. But there was a lot of rumors at the time that he was. But the fact that the Bolsheviks were the ones who mobilized to defeat Kornilov, again, gave them a huge credibility boost against the Mensheviks and the SRs. Now, while he's in exile, of course, Lenin writes The State and Revolution, which I would say, if there was no other book by Lenin that you would read, I would argue that this one would be, if I had one choice, I would read this one. If you have time for nothing else. Not that the rest of Lenin's work isn't equally valuable, but this was the work that, for me, when I was 18, reading this all those years ago back in rural Derbyshire, where I grew up, that's what sold Lenin to me as an eternal great thinker and revolutionary strategist. Because what Lenin recognized, and this is his intellectual development that he's doing, the intellectual work leading up to the insurrection. Now, what I mean by intellectual work is that he's not only writing this work, which is necessary to recover the revolutionary traditions of Marxism and take it away from the dead hand of the Second International, but also he engaging in the work of retraining, essentially, via writing this and having it distributed amongst the party cadre. He's retraining the party cadre, as he's had to do, as they've had to do repeatedly since the beginning of 1917. And he's specifically writing focused on the theory of the state, the Marxist theory of the state. And he has to do that because there's a large amount of confusion in the party about what is the nature of the Russian state now. Everybody could agree, or largely agree, on the nature of the Tsardom, and that had to go. Almost everybody was agreed on that, from at least in theory, from the social revolutionaries all through the Mensheviks to the Bolsheviks to the Mezreyantsi, Trotsky's in-between group, to the anarchists, all agreed that the Tsardom had to be destroyed. Now, the problem arose because you have this nominally bourgeois democratic republic, though how democratic it was is very doubtful in actual fact. But nominally, it's a bourgeois democratic republic. The Tsardom has gone, and you have at the time, even inside the Bolshevik Party itself, a great deal of confusion about what a bourgeois democratic republic is, and particularly because with the disappearance of the Tsardom, a lot of Russian Marxists, including, of course, Plekhanov, the grandfather of Russian Marxism, including the leaders of the Mensheviks, so Tsereteli, Fyodor Dan, people like that, and Chernov, the leader of the Social Revolutionaries, arguing that this achievement was something that needed to be preserved at all costs. Though there was some very sort of differing views as to what this meant, but they were very clear that they viewed the achievement of the bourgeois democratic republic in Russia as being the outer limits of what could be achieved. That the idea of worker worker rule in Russia was out of the question, that the idea of an alliance with the peasants was dangerous. This is the way in which a lot of people, and even in the Bolshevik Party, saw things. So Lenin undergoes the necessary work, does the necessary work of writing the State and Revolution when he's in exile over the border in Finland, in order to retrain and re-educate the cadres in the Bolshevik Party. Because the point that he's making in that book, and the point that becomes a very real one, is that in terms of how the Bolshevik Party proceeds, is that the bourgeois democratic republic might be, nominally more, or might be more democratic than the Tsardom, which wouldn't be hard, but that this is still a country which is ruled by the bourgeoisie. It's still a repressive state apparatus which is dedicated to protecting the property of the bourgeoisie and creating and maintaining the conditions for the exploitation of the workers and the peasants in the Russian case. And that's true of the Democratic Republic as it was true of the Tsardom. In fact, more true of the Democratic Republic, as it's something which is more attuned to the needs of the bourgeoisie, for all the attempts of the Russian bourgeoisie to make nice with the Tsardom. So Lenin has to write State and Revolution. He has to ram home the point that the bourgeois democratic republic is not the be-all and end-all. Now, the fact that there was so much confusion about this stems from, again, the battles that Lenin had fought, and others as well, to be fair. So Rosa Luxemburg was his comrade and ally in this fight, as was for a while people like Karl Kautsky against Eduard Bernstein and those who were called the economists of the 1890s, who were the open reformists in the German SPD. And they, along with many others, including like the French Parti Socialiste and the British Labour Party, which of course was never Marxist anyway, but all of them shared this in common, that this belief that the advance of the working class in terms of their winning more political rights under the reforms that took place in France, the unified Germany, and Britain in the late 19th century, which is the extension of the franchise to more workers, that this was going to be used to advance socialism, that there will be continued reforms until socialism triumphed. Of course, Lenin in Imperialism proved definitively where the money for those reforms was coming from. It was coming from the imperialists' hyper-exploitation of the colonial world, and also proved that it was the growth of a labor aristocracy in the imperialist countries was going to be potentially fatal for revolutionary parties, and so that proved. And so he has to write State and Revolution to reiterate this point, because the revolutionary content of Marxism had been lost in the Second International, and he and others didn't recognize how bad that had got until 1914, when, of course, all of the leaders of the Second International rolled over and either played dead or enthusiastically supported the war when it broke out, and enthusiastically supported the expansionist aims of the Russian bourgeoisie in the case of Plekhanov and other Menshevik leaders, the British bourgeoisie in the case of the Labour Party, the French bourgeoisie in the case of like a lot of the PS, and of course the most notorious of them all, the German SPD, having been led by people who committed verbally to internationalism and a general strike against war, went in with the Kaiser. So it's necessary to rescue Marxism from the embrace of this dead international and to refound it on a revolutionary basis, and to drive home the point that just because where the working class gets to vote, and this is a key point, because you can see where the revisionists and the reformists are able to sort of manipulate the intellectual legacy of Marx and Engels, because in a lot of the early writings, they're talking about the winning the battle for democracy and things like that. And you see many people up to this day still taking lines that were written in the 1840s by Marx and Engels and trying to justify support for bourgeois democracy by quoting that. And this went on a lot in Lenin's time as well. This is a lot of what he had to deal with. So he writes State and Revolution to drive home the point about why the bourgeois state has to be smashed, even in its most democratic form, even in the form of the bourgeois republic, the bourgeois democratic republic, that it has to be smashed, destroyed, etc., etc. And this is the point he takes to the Central Committee, or I should say he communicates to the Central Committee in written form about the need to now overthrow the bourgeois republic in Russia, which again was something that was something as a battle that he very much had to win. Even though he had the majority on his side, he had quite a number of very prominent opponents. Now, the other thing that's being done in the run-up to the insurrection is, of course, I didn't mention last week, and I'll mention it now, the work that Stalin was doing in the party at the time. He's doing two things. He's reorganizing the Bolshevik party in order to get it ready for insurrection and get the personnel ready for that. But he's also working on the nationality policy that the Bolsheviks would implement when they came to power. And that includes, of course, the nationality policy that was to be adopted by the new Soviet government that would seek to win the support of the minority nationalities within the old Tsarist empire by promising things like the right to secede from what was going to be a voluntary union of Soviet republics, ultimately, the protection for minority languages and minority religions and minority cultural expressions, all of which, of course, had been anathema under the time of the Tsar, and all of which was, again, remained a key part of Soviet nationality policy almost to the end of the Soviet Union. Even in the revisionist period, the protection for the languages of all the different peoples and republics. Bear in mind, there's even just within the borders of what was the RSFSR, which became the Russian Federation following the counter-revolution, there are myriad different languages and national groups and religions. But within the wider Soviet Union, of course, there were hundreds and hundreds. And it's a very important piece of policy to develop, to decisively break with both the Tsarist and the bourgeois traditions. And this, of course, ignites the ire of Russian reactionaries and Ukrainian reactionaries, actually, to this day. It's a good sign of if a policy is good, if both Russian reactionaries and reactionaries from the Baltic states, Ukraine, Georgia, and everywhere else all hate it. Now, I wanted just to address this briefly because we will deal more with the Ukraine question once we go on with this series and look at like the civil war. But there is an allegation that, again, is made by all kinds of these bilious Russian right-wingers that, Lenin broke up the great Russia and, he created these countries which had no historical basis, such as Ukraine. Now, this is, of course, nonsense. These reactionaries blame Lenin and the Bolsheviks for the separation of Ukraine from Russia. That's what they blame Lenin for that. But of course, in the Soviet era, Ukraine was a separate Soviet republic, but of course it all fell under the flag and under the system of government of the Soviet Union. It was not Lenin and the Bolsheviks who separated Ukraine from Russia. That was Yeltsin. That was Kravchuk. That was the Russian counter-revolutionaries. Ultimately, it's Gorbachev who refused to prevent it. But these bilious reactionaries frothing away on the Russian internet, on Telegram, etc., about how, and Putin himself has said this, of course, about how the Soviet nationality policy split up the glorious Russia. Well, the Soviet Union was a much better and elevated version of, or a new iteration of a Russia that had been sort of dominated by feudal reaction for decades and dominated by a pathetic and useless Russian bourgeoisie. The splitting up of the country was done by the principal secessionists, who were the pro-capitalists. They were the ones who broke up the Soviet Union. They were the ones who separated Ukraine from Russia and Belarus from Russia. They were the ones who created the situation which is now playing out to grisly and brutal effects on the battlefields of Ukraine. It was the bourgeois reactionaries that did that, because that was the price they chose to pay, including the monarchists and the cosplaying Russian Orthodox and the various epic-based nationalists. Their leader was Yeltsin, by the way. So a lot of these people ultimately fell in behind, even if they didn't like him very much, even if they didn't like his associations with the West very much, they still followed him, because the thing that mattered to these people in 89 to 93 was not the preservation of the borders of the Soviet state, was not the historic ties between Ukrainians and Russians. It was the restoration of capitalism. That's what mattered to them more than anything else. And so when it came to that choice, they were more than prepared to have the Soviet Union split into all its different component parts, then bitch and moan about their own crime later and try and blame it on the Bolsheviks. A side note, but a necessary one. So Stalin develops the nationality policy. And this is something which, again, is actually a huge element in that goes in the Bolsheviks' favor. They have like a nationality policy which is much more revolutionary than, of course, the Mensheviks or the social revolutionaries or any of the other groups in the Petrograd Soviet, which they're winning control of at the time. And this is one of Stalin's main areas of activity. And we'll come back to this when we talk more about the formation of the Soviet Union as an entity. But that's what Stalin's working on throughout 1918. Now, when we come to the insurrection itself, this is argued about in the Bolshevik Central Committee right up to the last minute. Right up to the last minute, there's people walking out. There's like Zinoviev and Kamenev leaking the information to the Mensheviks, trying to stop it. There's Trotsky, who gives away the date for the insurrection whilst out in public, and he's boasting about his coming role within it, which is a story I can well believe, given that the big thing for Trotsky, more than anything else, was his own ego. And if somebody pandered to his ego, there's no limit to what he'd confess to. But Lenin wins over the Central Committee in the end with the dissension of Zinoviev and Kamenev. They have to change the date of the insurrection. They have to bring it forward because of Trotsky's boasting and giving things away. And so they bring it forward to the day before the Congress of Soviets is to meet, which is why it happens on the day that it does. And ultimately, things go ahead in a sort of confused fashion, but ultimately the decisive move is made. So the Bolsheviks managed to seize control of the bridges in Petrograd, as it was called at the time. They managed to secure like the telephone exchange, the post office, most of the key government centers, and that's all done by the end of the day. By the end of the day, on the day of the revolution itself, if you look at John Reed's work in 10 Days That Shook the World, you'll see that it's actually in Petrograd. It all goes quite quickly. Kerensky tries to organize resistance, but he's unable to do so. The only people who rally to the support of the provisional government are a few officer cadets who are easily bottled up by revolutionary sailors from the Kronstadt base in some of the hotels that they're in. There's a few people still loyal to the Mensheviks and SRs who many of whom don't do anything at all. And it all falls apart for Kerensky and the provisional government really quickly. Why? Well, by the time the insurrection happens, support for the bourgeois republic has disappeared in Russia. There's very little of it left. The choice isn't, as I've said many times before, between a bourgeois democratic republic and the Bolsheviks. The choice is between Kornilov or Kolchak or Denikin or Kalidin or any other puppet of imperialism and the worker-led revolution. Now, the fate of Kerensky is quite interesting because on the morning of November 7th, that's the New Style calendar, Kerensky flees to a place called Gatchina, where he turns up and he demands a special train to help him flee. Then he flees to Ostrov in the province of Pskov. The next morning in Ostrov, there was an extraordinary session of the local Soviet with the participation of many Cossack delegates, because that was there was 6,000 army Cossacks in Ostrov. Kerensky addressed the assembly there and appealed for the help of the Cossacks against the Bolsheviks. This splits the audience. Many question why Kerensky is there. The noise, apparently, according to an eyewitness statement, reached such an intensity in terms of booing and people shouting at him that he had to retreat from the stage. Bear in mind, Kerensky is associated in the mind of the soldiers then with the failed offensive that had gone on previously, which was rumored to be largely a ruse to kill as many revolutionary soldiers as possible. Again, there's never just simply one cause for anything. The main reason for it was that Kerensky was trying to prove to the French and the British in particular that he was still able to field an army and therefore was still worthy of their support. That's the reason why he was doing it. Sounds a lot like Zelensky in Ukraine, really, but there you go. The point about all of this is that he is unable to rally any forces to him, because even those who might reject the Bolsheviks certainly don't like him too much. Though he was apparently well received by some of those who were called the Death Battalions at the time, which are proto-fascist military formations. So in the end, he wasn't able to mobilize many troops. About 5,000 of the Cossacks mobilized with him, but he by no means got all of the Cossacks. At the time, there was plenty of Red Cossacks, which is, again, like the extremely online Russian reactionaries would like to tell you that the Cossacks were all faithful to the Tsar. No, there was many Cossacks at the time who were enthusiasts of the revolution. The Don Cossacks were sort of on the side of Kerensky, but really they were following more sort of reactionary leaders than him. But the Ussuri Cossacks were on the side of the revolution. In fact, there was a lot of Red Cossacks who fought on the revolution side all the way through the Civil War and again in the Great Patriotic War. So Kerensky tries to rally support, having lost the capital overnight, fails, runs away, and he becomes rapidly an insignificant figure. And he becomes an insignificant figure because there's no room in the struggle, really, for what he was nominally standing for. He was a member of an organization that was kind of an adjunct to the social revolutionaries called the Trudoviks. He was a lawyer, and he had in the past defended revolutionaries in court. His fate in the revolution was to have his politics exposed for what they were, and this happened to a lot of people. because when it came down to it, what was Kerensky committed to? Kerensky was committed to bourgeois rule. That's what a lot of people were suddenly revealed as being really committed to. Kerensky, being committed to bourgeois rule, was led into any conspiracy possible that would disrupt and destroy the revolution. And this is why him and many others end up siding with first Kornilov and then the white Tsarist era generals. And it's the white Tsarist era generals who the power on the reactionary side passes to. Now in Moscow, unlike Petrograd, there is a lot of fighting because there is a stronger base of support there, not for reactionaries, but the principal first movers against the insurrection. Who are they? They're not even the white generals. It's the SRs and it's the Mensheviks. Now, the Mensheviks split at least two ways. A portion of them, the Menshevik internationalists, went and joined the Bolsheviks. They were, of course, associated with Julius Martov, who was an old friend of Lenin's, who seldom agreed with him politically towards from the days of the split onwards. But also, there was another group that became extremely reactionary, or maybe were always extremely reactionary, and they were the ones who formed the government of the supposedly independent Georgia. It was a Menshevik government that carried out brutal repressions against workers and peasants in Georgia, and was essentially a tool of the British. See, that's what, when you hear, if you're familiar with any so-called Georgian nationalists, they'll look back to the glory days of like 1918-19, when Georgia was independent. Well, wasn't much of an independence, really. They had a Menshevik government there that was controlled largely by the British. And that's the thing that the so-called Georgian nationalists look back on with such fond memories, apparently. But the Mensheviks in Moscow, along with the SRs, split. Some of them go with the Bolsheviks. Most of the leaders go with the white generals. As same thing happens to the SRs, who are principally they were primarily a peasant party, but the left SRs split from the social revolutionaries and initially join up with the Bolsheviks in the immediate aftermath of the revolution. The bulk of the SR leadership, though, froze in with the whites, and the alliance between the so-called moderate socialists in Russia and the white generals starts in Moscow, because again, the only forces that the provisional government supporters could actually mobilize was the officer cadets. So not the cadet party, even though some of them might have been cadet party members. It's the cadet officers from the military training schools. And in the Civil War later, there were occasions when there was entire units of the white armies that were made up solely of officers. There was almost no rank and file soldiery on some parts of the front. We'll come to that when we examine the Civil War. But so the leaders, the Menshevik and the SR leaders in Moscow, they are the ones who organize the defense of bourgeois rule. And they do so on the basis that they deny the possibility of any revolution led by workers and peasants being successful in Russia. That Russia is too backward, that they can't do it. They need a long period of capitalist economic development under a bourgeois democratic republic, which the Soviets will support. Of course, as we pointed out last week, that dual power cannot survive for too long. You cannot have two sources of authority in any country, particularly when those two sources of authority represent very, very different classes. So you've got the bourgeois power representing the capitalists and the landlords, and you have the proletarian power representing the unified working class and also the peasants, or I should be more accurate and say the small and landless peasants. The medium peasantry had also come over more to support the revolution due to the failure of the provisional government to do any meaningful land reform. And this is what this is where the agrarian program of the Bolsheviks comes in very handy to winning the support of those particular layers in the proletariat and the peasantry. So the revolution is greeted by the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies in the following terms. I'm going to read to you from the initial hand-printed release that was put out by the Bolsheviks immediately after the revolution. So it reads as follows: the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies, saluting the victorious revolution of the Petrograd proletariat and garrison, particularly emphasizes the unity, organization, discipline, and complete cooperation shown by the masses in this rising. Rarely has less blood been spilled, and rarely has an insurrection succeeded so well. The Soviet expresses its firm conviction that the workers' and peasants' government, which as the government of the Soviets will be created by the revolution, and which will assure the industrial proletariat of the support of the entire mass of poor peasants, will march firmly towards socialism, the only means by which the country can be spared the miseries and unheard of horrors of war. The new workers' and peasants' government will propose immediately a just and democratic peace to all the belligerent countries. It will suppress immediately the great landed property and transfer the land to the peasants. It will establish workmen's control over production and distribution of manufactured products, and will set up a general control over the banks, which it will transform into a state monopoly. And that's the first proclamation made. So again, that represents like the peace, bread, land element. So on the peace element there was a proposal made to all of the countries that were locked in battle in World War I to reach an immediate agreement on a cessation of hostilities. Of course, they all rejected that. But most crucially in that, there is the question of the land. And the question of the land is, I would argue, what killed the Social Revolutionary Party more than anything else, because they existed as the descendants of the Narodniks in Russia to represent the peasants, and they were this sort of amorphous populist party because they represented, or tried to represent, the different layers of the peasantry in Russia. So they had some rich peasants who had become landowners, particularly after some of the agrarian reform done immediately after the abolition of serfdom. You had a large layer of sort of petty bourgeois middle peasants who were small landowners who were often beholden to other landowners. Then you had the great bulk of the peasantry, which were, of course, either lower middle peasants or small peasants who either owned tiny amounts of land or no land at all. And it's to them that the Bolshevik agrarian policy was addressed. And it's the winning over of that middle peasant layer and the lower peasant layer that actually pushed things forward for the Bolsheviks in a significant way. See, had they not secured that alliance with the peasantry by making that commitment that commitment, now they were able to do that because the SR party failed in the months that their leaders were either supporting the provisional government or were in the provisional government to do any land reform. The great estates were not touched. So you got to the point where the small peasants were actually arbitrarily seizing the land themselves and driving the landlords off the estates. And yet the SRs remained frozen, wouldn't do anything. Why? Because they had come to be merely support acts for the Russian bourgeoisie. Now, Russian bourgeoisie, whilst it did want some land reform, it did want to drain the power away of the landlords who might oppose them. they were far more terrified of the peasantry and the proletariat than they were of the landlords. And they actually wanted an alliance with the landlords to stop the advance of the revolution. And because of that, the SRs and the Mensheviks ended up in a coalition with the landlords, because they were supporting the Russian bourgeoisie, and the Russian bourgeoisie didn't want to do anything to endanger their coalition with the landlords. So the SRs had a land reform program, which Chernov accused Lenin of stealing. And he might have been right, but the SR's land reform program was never put into practice. So the Bolsheviks then went to the peasants and said, the SRs have betrayed you. We will enact the land reform program if you are prepared to come into an alliance with the proletariat and support the revolution. And the great bulk of the peasantry did so, and indeed stuck with the Bolsheviks up to the end of the Civil War, because the great bulk of the peasantry, even the middle peasantry, didn't want to fight in the white armies for the landlords and for the military officers who were running them. And so the alliance with the Bolsheviks was sealed and lasted for a very long time. Now, the evolution of of what became the Russian Civil War really starts in Moscow and goes from there. And what you see is, as with the Mensheviks in Georgia and elsewhere, an alliance between the capitalists, the landlords, and the so-called moderate socialists. Over and over again, this happens in many, and we'll cover it when we come to the Civil War, just how many times it is that there's these where the Bolsheviks are defeated somewhere, a unity government pops up between landlords, local capitalists, and the so-called moderate socialists, Mensheviks, SRs, etc., backed up by the military force of the French and the British quite a lot of the time. That was certainly the case in Georgia and other places in the South. So we'll come to that in the future episodes. But the point here to come back to end my comments where I began is that the division that would plague what became the CPSU was there from the very beginning. And again, it's still there at the time of the Khrushchev era. It's still there in the Gorbachev era, which is the tendency of particularly Russian or later Soviet so-called Soviet political leaders, so-called intellectuals, and sort of management stratum types to cringe before what they assume to be the power of the capitalist nations. In the 1900s, it was a desperation for the German Revolution to succeed, and a belief that if it didn't succeed, that nothing would be possible. This was Trotsky's point of view. This was, in 1917, Zinoviev's point of view, Kamenev's point of view. Later on, it became the view of people around Khrushchev, and it was very much the view of people around Gorbachev, a belief in not just the necessity of a revolution in the West. They no longer believed that, but that they could never hope to actually oppose the West, nor should they. See how this devolved away from believing, as the more sincere Trotskyites did in the 1920s, that a revolution in Germany was necessary for the revolution in Russia to succeed, which you could see why people would believe that. You could see why people would sincerely believe that. They were wrong completely, but again, you could see why it would be a belief. To later on in the Khrushchev and then the Gorbachev era, believing that not only was it the case that the Soviets needed collaboration with the industrialized West, but also that it was wrong to even oppose them anymore. Opposing them was impossible and undesirable. All of this is rooted, unfortunately, in the worst traditions of, shall we say, the Russian revolutionaries going all the way back to the early 19th century. It degenerates in the Soviet period to become this sort of cringing before the West, and degenerates further from there to become Yeltsinism. But the point here is that it was always there. within the Bolshevik Party, and Lenin had to fight it, and Stalin had to fight it, and after Stalin they stopped fighting it. And what was proved, though, by the heroic deeds of the workers and sailors and soldiers of Petrograd and Moscow on that 1917 was that this was the first time that the bourgeois order had been decisively smashed. And you see it in Reed's book, where like you've got Reed's account of generals stomping around Petrograd, trying to order sailors and soldiers about. And Reed gives one account of like some reactionary general screaming that he's a general and has to be let into this building. And this peasant soldier nervously saying no and denying him entry. And this general just can't believe it. He can't believe that like this peasant is defying him. And that's why I would recommend Reed's book, because it does give you it does bring home to you the change in class power that's going on. Because like all the characters that come onto the page that Reed brings to life, shall we say, when you're looking at it now, there's so many of them who are like described as having like the faces of like Mongolian peasants. They're people who've been through the army. Many of them from the Far East. They're like participating in this revolution, and those are the faces of the people who are powering the revolution. Those are the faces of the people who are overthrowing the bourgeois rule. And you see in when he describes, because he's kind of moving between the different sides, you see the gloom and the depression and the consternation and the despair in the faces of the Russian reactionaries, that these peasants and workers and peasants in uniform, in the case of the soldiers and sailors, are defying them. See, there's no doubt, if you, again, in the accounts of the early period of the revolution, as to who is powering things. Now, yes, later Kerensky and others would claim that it was all a Bolshevik conspiracy, and that it was all just a terrible, terrible mistake. But again, in the early period, like even the reactionaries are quite clear on what's going on, which is that they've been deposed by the hated Russian proletariat and peasantry. And they're appalled by it, and they can't believe it. And this is the reason why the Russian Civil War is so vicious, because it's the bourgeoisie and all of again, let's go back to what we were talking about when we were talking about Gramsci's theory analysis of the intellectuals. You have the Russian bourgeoisie, you have the Russian landowners, and you have like the hierarchy of the Russian Orthodox Church, which again, the church was one of the biggest landowners in old Russia. You have all of their hangers-on. So you have all the officer caste, or a great bulk of the officer caste from the old Tsarist army. You have the hierarchy of the priesthood. You have all of the different professionals whose fate and salary was tied to the existence of the bourgeois order. All of them, all of this is what is powering the white armies. It's not just Tsardom, even though that's part of it. It's the very concept of private property. Remember what the proclamation of the Petrograd Soviet said about the land to the peasants and the nationalization of the banks and all the banks' assets? Well, that was the death blow to the Russian bourgeoisie, because as Lenin analyzed, the banks were at the center of it. That was, and once the banks are taken over and all their assets are seized, that's the death of the bourgeoisie in Russia. And so they knew what they were facing, which was the complete severing of their power. And that's why all the bourgeois sympathizers, the intellectual sympathizers, such as those in the Mensheviks and the SRs, screamed at Lenin that he was a bandit, an insurrectionist, a leader of a peasant revolt, a man who'd taken inspiration from the worst aspects of anarchism. But what you see in all of this is the cold fear of the property owners and their intellectual stratum that their rule is over, that it's the time of the worker and the Russian peasant now. And that explains the ferocity of the Civil War, because they understood what this foundation of the Soviet Union really meant. And by the way, the bourgeois trends in the Soviet Union itself always reacted in the same way. They always went in the same direction when it came to the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat, because as we've covered when we talked about Stalin's work and the Stalin era, plenty of these people, when they were defeated in the Civil War, well, many of them fled to the West, and many others, though, decided to keep their heads down and hide themselves in the state structure and even in the CPSU itself. But the bourgeois tendencies, when they re-emerge, always talk about the same things. They always view the working class and the Soviet working class and peasantry as crude, backward-looking, lovers of dictatorship, oppressors of artists and other sensitive souls, incapable of rule, that without them, the great bourgeois intellectuals, there will be no possibility of succeeding. This is the view of Trotsky. This is the view of like all of the internal reactionaries in the Soviet Union right up until the end. But the different trends were all there at the beginning and they were all there at the end, just maybe in a little bit slightly changed form. But those reactionaries who fought so hard and committed so many horrible crimes to preserve bourgeois rule, those are the people we'll be covering in the coming weeks when we get to the Civil War, who they were, what they were fighting for, and where they all ended up, because quite a lot of them ended up in the US, France, and Britain. France being a particular favorite for a certain type of Russian reactionary back in the day. So that brings us to the close of this particular episode. Now, next week, we're going to be talking about the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the ending of Russian involvement in the Great War, and the beginning, how one war merged into another, how the First World War was barely over for the Russians before the Civil War and the defense of the revolution began. And so we're going to be covering the foundation of the Red Army, why the Red Army was such a different beast, even when it had gone all the way through the war, and the foundations of the Soviet Republic. We're going to be covering that in the coming weeks. So thank you very much for tuning in. So we're going to be take a few questions before we come to the end here. So and do some greetings for the chat. So hello to Svetlana, hello to Patrick in Bristol, hello to Chandler, Brolin, Cooper Ward in the Midwest of the United States, Working Prole Incorporated, Jerry, President Jesus, Mo Tanks, Dingo Ate Me Baby, the man with the greatest name on the internet, Slumbering Colossus, as was, now renamed, Rob the Slav from Detroit. Also got Jenny Alistair from Prague, Zhukov's Boots from Birmingham. Is that Birmingham, West Midlands, or West Midlands of England, or Birmingham, Alabama? Do tell. Zhukov's Boots. Hello to Iskra Gulyas from Hungary, Nikolai Mer, Sun Chitu, Marius, Eman, Comrade Jawad. What else we got here? JR Shield. Svetlana says, in 1870 to 71, Marx taught himself Russian. In a letter to Engels, his wife complained that Marx was studying Russian as if it were a matter of life and death. Good for Marx. Well, he realized the coming importance of Russia. And again, like the intellectual evolution of Marx and Engels from being sort of instinctively suspicious of all things Russian due to the traditional role that the Tsardom was playing in early 19th century Europe as the defender of absolutism. They came to regard Russia as a crucial part of the revolutionary struggle. People like the jacket and jumper look. Well, it is winter, so I've got to adapt the wardrobe somewhat. Brolin says, how was the revolution financed? I mean, where did most of the financial support come from? Good question. I think what I'll do is I will add that to my list of things to address in the next Q&A. So part of it was allegedly bank robberies in the early days, though that story about Stalin being a bank robber is now disputed by certain sources. There was a variety of ways in which the Bolshevik Party was financed. One of those was, of course, certain dues paid by the members themselves. Some of it was contributions from some of the wealthier people that supported the Bolshevik Party in its early years, because there were those that did it, that did sort of bourgeois types who supported at least the idea of revolution. Whether they continue to do so is another question. But we'll come to that specifically in future episodes. Did anyone see Zara Sultana has generously given Jez's party back the first tranche of the £800,000 she stole? Well, here's the thing, Zhukov's boots. They're all fucking thieves. There's no doubt about that in my mind. This whole thing, this foundation of your party. I mean, God Almighty, what a fucking ridiculous name. This is a thieves' party. This is a party of people who want to get paid, basically. And I don't think there's any reason to call it anything other than that. It's a party for those who want to remain a permanent oppositional and well-paid establishment left. It's a party of thieves. That's all it is. It's the same with those of you. There are those in the United States who do similar. So the DSA is a party of thieves. Your party is a party of thieves. Why is anybody still falling for this? Well, the traditions of reformism and the false promises of reformism are unfortunately very strong in old perfidious Albion, and a lot of people still fall for it. But people really got to stop falling for it. It's a party of thieves. They're just people looking for an easy job. They're looking to get paid. That's all that's going on here. Michael McGoldrick says Russia is winning the proxy war. Indeed. Apparently the Buy Me a Coffee link doesn't accept Google Pay or prepaid cards. Well, I'll have to have a look into that. I'll make a note of looking at what alternative ways. The other way, if you want to support the project and you can't do Patreon for whatever reason, you can take out a subscription on the Substack page, which is where we're streaming at the moment. Thanks to all those of you who are watching on Substack. We're going to be all future live streams are going to be on Substack as well. Hello, David Ball. Hello to Sophia, who says the story is that during a visit to Washington, D.C. in 1995, a drunk Russian President Boris Yeltsin was found by Secret Service agents on Pennsylvania Avenue wearing only his underwear. Probably true. I mean, look, how much was Yeltsin actually in charge of anything? I would say very, very doubtful that he ever was. The whole thing is absurd. The idea that he was ever in charge of anything. I mean, the guy was so fucking pissed off his face most of the time that I think he went into a very steep decline after about 93, 94, etc. But he was always a drunk. I mean, these kind of pathetic drunkards are just always who the capitalists choose to put in charge. Eman says, will you be addressing Anthony Sutton's claim as to how the Bolshevik Revolution was funded? Yeah, I can address it right now. Sutton's claims are all nonsense. His claim that like Wall Street bankers financed the revolution in Russia is categorically untrue. This is, and again, this is like typical like reactionary stuff, like the claim that Wall Street funded it. Well, Wall Street actually funded the continuation of World War One. I mean, it was the U.S. imperialists who made it possible for the certainly for the French and the British to go on fighting when they were bankrupting themselves and couldn't produce enough war material. So they had a vested interest, in making sure that the bourgeois mode of production was remained remained in place in Russia. The U.S. invaded eastern Russia when after the October Revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power. So it's a funny way of securing. If you're making an investment in a revolution for your interests, why on earth would you then invade and try and depose the people that you'd financed coming to power? This doesn't make any sense. Basically, what Sutton's claims amount to is the same shit that the Hitlerites used to say, just with a slightly more sophisticated form. The Hitlerites, because they had to appeal to petty bourgeois who hated the banks, said that the banks are your enemy because they not only do they fund not only are they your enemy because they seize your property, but they also fund communism, which also wants to seize your property. It's like this reactionary fascistic nonsense of Sutton is foolish garbage. I mean, I can cover it in more detail, but yeah, this is typical like Anglo reactionary stuff. Doesn't make any amount of sense if you actually examine what were the concrete actions of the US government and bourgeoisie. And their concrete actions were funding the continuation of World War One and then invading Russia when the proletariat took power. Okay. Is there any class comparable to the peasantry in today's imperialist states? No, I would say, to President Jesus' question. There's in terms of like, agricultural proletariat, very little well, it's different in the United States. I think there's more people proportionally employed in agriculture in the United States than there is in old perfidious Albion. But I wouldn't say that would qualify it as a peasantry. I would say those engaged in agriculture in the United States are agricultural proletarians more than anything else. I wouldn't say that there is in the imperialist states. There's even where there's like more. There are, of course, in some countries more small to medium farm owners. So in France, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, etc., there are more small to medium agricultural landowners due to the fact that they were protected for longer than they were in Britain. But a vast peasantry that's like either landless or small property owners doesn't exist in the West, hasn't done for years. Zhukov's boots is in the one and only real Birmingham that's been there for 1400 years. I used to live there. Lived there for 5 years in the mid-2000s. Alistair says, your party, possibly the worst name ever. Very true. Can anybody tell me what the flag is? That flag is a merger of the Saltire of Scotland and the Palestinian flag. We take it with us on demonstrations in Glasgow. Okay, so right, I'm going to draw things to a close for this evening. We'll be back tomorrow with the latest episode in the Gramsci series, so be sure to join me for that one. This episode will be edited and go up on the Patreon page. We've got another Patreon Q&A coming up on Monday of next week, so be sure to join us for that. Keep an eye out for more episodes of Decline and Fall as well. That'll be coming very soon. But until tomorrow, Thanks for joining me tonight for this second episode in the ongoing series covering the October Revolution. More on this next week, and I will see you again very soon.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.